Good afternoon. Welcome to VIB's webinar, Preventing Supply Chain Ransomware Attacks, Your PR and Legal Strategies. I'm Victor Berlin, and I will be your moderator today. But before we get started, we're very excited to have with us today Mr. Mark Rash, the founder of the U.S. Department of Justice Cybercrime Unit. He's also served as the Verizon Cyber Televangelist and was a founding counsel to the board of ISC Squared, which sponsors the CISSP certification. Mark, glad to have you today.
Thank you, Victor. Glad to be here.
What we're going to focus on today are ransomware attacks, and specifically your software supply chain ransomware attacks. We're going to look at what's been happening overall, what the trends are. Then we'll focus in on the vulnerabilities that you need to protect in your software supply chain. We'll then move on to look at the legal strategies and PR strategies that can help you with protecting your firm against these attacks. And last, we'll certainly focus on next steps. The trend for ransomware attacks is rapid growth, 6,000% growth between 2015 and 2020, growth to $20 billion a year. And the data stolen has also grown exponentially. So Mark, what do you see overall fueling this growth, and specifically how it impacts the software supply chain?
Well, one of the reasons why we see a massive explosion of ransomware attacks is because a lot of attacks, hacker attacks, have always been triggered by motivation for money. And the hackers want to make as much money as they can. Now, in the early days of the internet, that was done by stealing credit card numbers and then using them to make money. Then it moved from stealing credit card numbers and using them to stealing credit card numbers and selling them. Then it moved from stealing credit card numbers to stealing other trade secrets and selling that. What ransomware is a direct attack on the confidentiality of data. So what they do is they either steal data and threaten to release it unless you pay them money, which is extortionware, or they lock up files and data, shutting you down unless you pay them money. And one of the big things that's fueled it is more sophisticated computers with more access points that are more dependent upon a larger supply chain that's more vulnerable, and frankly, they can get paid through cryptocurrency without much chance of getting caught. So all of those things are showing an explosion of ransomware attacks.
How big an impact has been the cryptocurrency trend?
Well, I think it's huge because in the old days you could do ransomware, but there was no way for you to make money off of it because there was no way you could get paid without being caught. Cryptocurrency now allows you to engage directly with the victim and have the victim pay you.
Got it. So now let's take a look at what the methods are that these attackers are using. Phishing is the most common, but there are these other attack methodologies. So what trends do you see in terms of attack methods, especially as it relates to the software supply chain, Mark?
So the whole point of ransomware is to get in, get to a system that you want to, sometimes to get data, but often simply to corrupt the data or corrupt the network or systems. And so the fundamental thing you need to do is to be able to get into the site. And any technique that you can use to get in, whether it is phishing or spoofing or social engineering or malware or links to spoof sites or direct infections, anything you can do to get either code running on the machine or somebody to do something that will cause code to run on the machine will facilitate that kind of an attack.
Now let's look at what's happening to our audience. We'd like to hear from our audience what their experience with software supply chain attacks are. Let's take a look at the results. So looks like about a third of our audience feels they are well protected. About a third have never been attacked. 17% have been attacked but never paid any ransom. A quarter have been attacked and successfully recovered. But a quarter feel they need to improve their protection. So let's move forward with our discussion, take a look at what some of the options are for
I do want to point out, as with the poll, these are not mutually contradictory or mutually exclusive. You can feel like you're doing an adequate job and you have to do more. And one of the interesting things about ransomware attacks, unlike data breaches, is if you've had a successful ransomware attack, successful to the attacker, you know it. Otherwise, it's not successful. And that's the nature of a successful ransomware attack. Data breaches, you can have a breach and not know the data has been breached or sold or used for weeks, months, or years.
So at least with respect to ransomware, you know that you've been hit.
Right. It's noisy.
These vulnerabilities for the software supply chain explain a little bit why there's a growth in this area. The speed with which they can occur in the software supply chain, the stealth of it, but then the magnitude of damage. How does this compare with the kind of vulnerabilities you're observing in terms of the clients you deal with in the industry sector you're focused on?
Well, I'm focused on a number of different industry sectors. And one of the things that we talk about when we talk about supply chain is the fact that you think you know what industry sector you are in. You might be in banking, you might be in finance, you might be in insurance, you might be in healthcare. But if you're in healthcare, your industry group is telecommunications. Your industry group is trucking and transportation. Your industry group is power generation, because a hospital can't continue to run without electricity. A hospital can't continue to run without supplies. And so you are vulnerable to attacks anywhere along your software supply chain. That is, the people who make your hardware, your software, your embedded software, your firmware, your cables, your phones, anywhere there, but also within a supply chain of all the goods and services necessary to enable you to be able to continue to work. So we focus on ourselves, and the supply chain tells us we need to focus on an infrastructure.
And to what extent do you find firms really taking the perspective that you've just shared, which is looking at their multiple supply chains?
They do so, but not in the right way. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes when I talk about some of the legal regimes that you can do to protect yourself.
Great. So how do ransomware attacks work? Well, they have to penetrate your system, obviously, as you described. They have to infect your system, and then they have to encrypt the data in your system. How much do you feel firms really understand these aspects of the attack process?
Well, I think that they understand that theoretically this is how it works. Okay, and remember that the penetration and infection are both the same types of defenses to that they would have to any other kind of an attack. The encryption is interesting because there are all kinds of different ways to respond to a ransomware attack that are different from normal threats and vulnerabilities. One of the things about a ransomware is at some point, somebody's going to make a demand for payment, which means you're going to be communicating with the attacker. In a data theft, a data breach, or just a virus, the attacker does not communicate with you. So these are differences.
Great. So let's take a look at how do you prevent the ransomware attacks? In other words, and what you're saying is whether it's a ransomware attack or another breach, you need to block the penetration, you need to block or manage the infection, but the difference then becomes how do you stop or reverse the encryption? And that's these are the methods that we want to start looking at shortly. But do you see firms paying attention to these three aspects, especially the stopping aspect as it relates to the software supply chain?
Well, so one of the problems is, of course, you can only control that part of your environment that is your part of the environment, right? And so we are not doing enough to require third parties to protect themselves against ransomware that'll impact us, and that's part of the legal requirement. Blocking penetration and blocking access and stuff, we're doing a fair to middling job of that. Some companies are doing better, some are doing worse, but one of the problems is that the defender has to defend against every possible way of breaking in, whereas the attacker only has to find one way to break in. And so we're always going to be behind the curve on those.
So let's talk about methods of protection. Typically, you look at backup strategy, which is your resilience, your recovery process. There's endpoint security. And then as you've pointed out, previously, training to create the culture you need, the security awareness culture, so your employees and your customers avoid phishing attacks and other attempts to get in. What do you
Right.
see in terms of these methods?
Well, so we do, some protection methods and some training, but what we really need to do is what you just described, is creating a culture of security whereby people understand why what they do impacts the overall security of a company, and what they can do about it. Most ransomware, you go back, you find somebody in the organization who inadvertently clicked on a link or followed something they shouldn't have followed. And if you can, the best way to prevent that is all the things that you normally do to prevent phishing attacks from occurring.
Do you find certain sectors or certain firms have done a better job at this, and what's motivating
Not so much
them?
sectors or firms, so much as size of organizations. Larger organizations typically have more resources dedicated to it, have more comprehensive programs, but they have a larger threat footprint. So there's a little give and take.
Got it. So now, if you've been attacked, the methods of recovery, if you've been infected or your data has been encrypted, these are methods that are commonly being used. Again, what are the trends that you observe in the supply chain for these methods of recovery?
All right. So the first thing you want to do is keep them out of your system. If you can't keep them out of your system, keep them out of parts of your system. And that means to have internal firewalls, to have internal data segmentation, to quarantine them, to keep them away from other systems, limit the amount of damage. Then finally, have the ability to respond, what we call ransomware resilience, the ability to respond by either restoring data from backup, creating new systems that are more resilient, including virtualized systems, or the ability to unlock and recover the data with or without the help of the threat actor.
Right. So far we've been talking about what I would call technical methods or administrative methods, but now let's talk about the legal and PR strategies that can be used to protect against attack, or implement attack recovery methods, or prevent or minimize negative legal and customer impacts. To what extent do you see firms being self-consciously aware of legal and PR strategies that can help them?
Well, I don't think in ransomware, most companies are focusing on either legal or PR strategies. They're focusing on technical responses to it. In other words, how do we respond after the fact? And there's a lot of stuff that you need to do before the attack and during the attack and after the attack that relate to legal and PR strategies. So for example, being prepared with crisis communications, having a legal response that requires companies to whom you're connected to also have the same level of protection that you have. Having companies that are within your supply chain report to you if there's been an attack, so that you can have a coordinated response to it. Requiring them to have data backups and stuff. All of that needs to be part of it.
So what you're describing essentially is compliance management. Having a compliance management system help protect you and help minimize your liabilities. Do you see compliance becoming more and more a focus of firms in trying to deal with this?
Somewhat. What we're starting to see is companies require people in their identified supply chain do something about data security, which also helps in the area of ransomware. They're not requiring enough, and they're not really identifying who's really in their supply chain.
So when we talk about compliance, let's first of all have our audience respond and talk about what legal strategies they're already using or tried to use in preventing software supply chain ransomware attacks. Well, it doesn't seem to be working, so we'll move on and take a look at the next, focus more on the compliance. So you started talking about compliance strategies, and obviously in trying to prevent attacks, you've got to have compliance requirements that you're going to direct or impose on your supply chain as well as your own organization. But once you've developed those requirements and promulgated them, you then have to monitor your supply chain to make sure they're actually implementing them. And finally, If they're not implementing them, you need to have some form of enforcement to make sure that they do implement it. Now, in the Department of Defense is doing this in a more systematic way. Their supply chain has been a major problem for them. So they've imposed a requirement that every DoD contractor now has to begin to undergo a third-party audit to make sure they are complying with their cybersecurity standards. So they've promulgated the requirements, the standards. It's called the NIST 800 171 or the CMMC, and they then require the firms to be audited. They need a third-party audit to monitor, have they complied with those standards? If they find they haven't passed the audit, then the enforcement is that contractor is barred from future DoD contracts. They lose their source of business. It's a draconian impact. So how much do you see this kind of process occurring in the private sector, where there is a systematic monitoring and systematic enforcement?
I would say that somewhat. I mean, companies are starting to require third-party assessments of certain critical vendors, suppliers, or cloud providers. One of the problems you have is, let's assume that you have documents in the Google Cloud, right? Are you going to require a third-party audit or assessment of the Google Cloud? And is Google going to agree to allow you to do it? I don't think so. So there are all kinds of, you have your email up in the cloud. You know, are you going to require Microsoft to have a third-party assessment and report on it to you? I don't think that's going to happen either. So,
but there is, for example, FedRAMP, which is the federal government's cloud solution certification process, which also requires an audit. If Google or Microsoft or any vendor wants to sell their cloud solutions or systems to the
federal cloud solutions,
right? But
right,
that is a version of validation that they could use, correct? They could turn to the private sector and say, I'm FedRAMP certified, or I've passed my CMMC certification.
Right. I mean, it's certainly the ability to share those certifications makes the cloud providers more, I would say, marketable to customers. They say, not only are we secure, but here's a certification of security. The problem is, our supply chain is much broader than those in the electronic supply chain. Our supply chain extends to companies like SolarWinds or Colonial Pipeline. You know, that's part of our supply chain as well.
Got it. So the things, though, that you need to require, if we're talking about some specific examples of compliance requirements, these are the kinds of things that your supply chain, your software supply chain needs to adhere to. And certainly these fall within what DoD is requiring and what FedRAMP requires to protect the federal government's supply chain. Are firms becoming more self-conscious about these elements in the compliance side?
So they are, but the problem is they are not pushing these down on their vendors, suppliers, third parties, and people like that. Okay. And without doing that, they haven't protected their supply chain.
So if they're enforcing, one of the legal strategies, and certainly the federal government does this, is having alternative vendors. So built into their contracts, they have contingency plans so they can do vendor replacement. There's an insurance component, and I know you feel very strongly about liaison with your law enforcement partner, the FBI. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So, I mean, these are things you can do in advance to say, I know I'm going to get hit by ransomware. What do I do in advance? And one of them is to say, well, is there someplace else I can restore my data? Is there another vendor or supplier I can move to in the cloud? Do I have liability protection, and do I have insurance to cover the actual costs? And the Ghostbusters question, who are you going to call? And I often tell people, never call the FBI. Instead, call Bob. Bob is the FBI agent that you met at an InfraGard meeting 2 years ago that you have a relationship with, so that you can call them and get something done. Because oftentimes when you call law enforcement, nothing happens because you are the 25th of 29 priorities of them for that particular day. If you have a pre-established relationship with law enforcement, you can then take advantage of that and try to get them to do something.
In terms of the legal strategies for helping to achieve compliance, where you want vendor compliance, employee compliance, and customer compliance, the strategies, are they just restricted to what goes into the contract, or is there more they can do besides putting the clauses in the contract?
Well, okay, so it's not enough to say, okay, you sign the contract, we're done. In fact, if you present a comprehensive information security contract to a vendor and they say, yes, we'll sign it, you need a different vendor, because that means all they're doing is signing the contract. They're not actually doing what's required. That should be a negotiation. Yes, we'll do this. Yes, we can do that. This will do over time, that kind of stuff. If they just sign it, it means they didn't even read it. They didn't bother. They just want your business. So you want to be able to establish who has liability in the case of a ransomware attack, who owns the attack, who responds to it, who pays for it, and all of that. How do you do patch management? How do you do monitoring? All that stuff, and all that needs to be done in advance. And it's not just to achieve compliance; it's to achieve actual security.
So I know in one of the tools that NIST has come up with the NIST risk management framework, do you find that being used in the private sector now as a guideline and making sure vendors comply with the NIST risk management framework as a tool?
They are, because, if I tell you, I want you to secure your data, and they say, how secure do you want it? Well, if you say absolutely secure, they're going to tell you that they can't afford to do that. Say, I want it to be reasonable. Say, well, what's reasonable security? Well, here's NIST. That looks reasonable to me.
And they use that as a guideline.
Yes. And that's what it's intended to be. It is not the gospel. It's not absolute. And you should pick and choose from NIST those things that are reasonable considering your risk profile.
So if they do get hit, and again, part of your recommendation, I believe, is to plan ahead and a legal strategy in advance to help reduce liabilities. That's why contracts need to specify the responsibilities and duties, vendor alternates, redundancies, corporate policies, and required training. A lot of this falls under what a NIST risk management framework requires. Do you find contracts beginning to specify these things?
I do. And again, mostly in larger, more sophisticated environments. All right. But this is part of your disaster recovery and business continuation planning, making sure that you have corporate policies and training, and so that when you're one big thing is tabletop exercises as well, because a tabletop exercise, as distinguished from a policy or training, really helps people incorporate knowledge and experience rather than simply compliance.
What you're basically saying is you need to practice these strategies. You just don't put them on the shelf.
That's right. I mean, look, ransomware is ungodly expensive and disruptive to companies. It is, in many cases, an existential event, and we need to treat it like that.
So we now come to legal strategies and the post-attack impacts. If you've done your planning in advance, as you're suggesting, and you've got your legal strategies in place, you now begin to implement them to protect yourself against liabilities, to replace vendors, and to engage law enforcement. Have you seen this happening at all?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so the liability protection is essentially insurance. Okay, and you need to make sure that not that you have insurance, but that you have the right insurance. So some insurance policies are cyber risk insurance that might not cover you. So other ones are data breach insurance that might not cover you. Other ones are data breach notification insurance that won't cover you for a ransomware attack. Extortionware attacks, pay me money or I will release this information, may not be covered by ransomware insurance coverage. Ransomware may cover only the cost of rebuilding and not the cost of paying ransom. So you need to read these policies carefully to understand what it is you're getting and whether you have comprehensive insurance. On the other hand, if you decide to pay the ransom, if you decide not to pay the ransom, the insurance may not pay for the cost of damages because of the disproportionality between the ransom demanded and the cost. So for example, Baltimore, they refused to pay $50,000 ransom and suffered a $25 million loss. the insurance company, if there was one, which there wasn't, could come back and say, wait a second, we could have taken care of this with $50,000. We're not paying the $25 million, that kind of stuff. Second thing is to have the ability to replace vendors. Make sure your contracts give you that ability in the event of a breach, and that you have then somebody else lined up. And third, of course, to engage law enforcement, which many companies are reluctant to do in a ransomware because they don't want to admit that something happened.
So in terms of replacing vendors, what's key is that you have a backup or alternate vendor. So that's part of the planning process. So
That's correct.
all of this relates to effective planning.
That's right. That's right. And in fact, knowing where your data is, doing data mapping, knowing what your critical data is, knowing what you need to have up and running in 4 hours, 12 hours, 2 days, and 2 weeks. All of that is part of what you need to do.
Great. So we've talked about legal strategies. Let's talk about the PR strategies to prevent attacks. So this is essentially communicating with your vendors, communicating with your employees, and communicating with your customers. So how much do you see either the software supply chain or the firms undertaking PR strategies to try to do the prevention, to establish the culture of security awareness that you mentioned before?
Well, I mean, some companies are doing a better job than others, okay? So one of the problems is very few companies have developed a comprehensive public relations scheme for crisis communications during a ransomware attack. What to say, who to say it, what methodology used to say it. And the problem is that some ransomware attacks are ransomware attacks and data breaches. Some are just data breaches, and some are just ransomware attacks. And so the question is, who do you need to communicate to? How do you need to communicate with them? What are you going to say? Who's going to make the comments? All that needs to be decided in advance.
The next poll question, let's see if we can get it to work, is what is your current PR strategy for software supply chain attacks? We'd like to hear about it. If the poll doesn't work, if you could tell us a little bit in the chat session, that would be great. The poll does not seem to be working. So if you could tell us a little bit in the chat session what your current PR strategy is for software supply chain ransomware attacks, that would be super. So PR strategies to improve compliance. We've talked about educating vendors, making sure you have vendor alternates, making sure your employees are aware of the potential threats they face in their day-to-day job, but also making sure your customers are aware of what they can do. Again, the entire cultural change has to cut across all these areas to improve compliance. Do you see any capabilities or services out there that can help firms implement these kinds of strategies and get that culture change?
Well, there are a lot. I mean, there are all kinds of vendors and suppliers who are security vendors, training, education vendors. The insurance companies can work with you to do education and training. But really what you need to do is your CISO needs to be knowledgeable about this type of stuff and be able to work with various consulting companies to develop a strategy, insurance companies to do liability protection, and then the biggest and hardest part about this is identifying who is in your supply chain. Upon whom am I reliant?
Well, it sounds like that's a major effort.
It is. I mean, look, most companies don't even know where their data is, much less who controls it.
So that brings us to the next element here, which is setting up the messaging. You talked about a systematic process for messaging and a communication plan so you can minimize liabilities and restore operations in the post-attack scenario.
Right.
And you need to also messaging for employee morale and customer retention. So all of this would go into the communications plan in advance. You don't want to be doing this after the fact, correct?
Right. You don't want to be doing this at 3 o'clock in the morning. That's not the time to start writing your incident response plan or your public relations strategy. Okay. And unfortunately, too many entities are doing that at 3 in the morning. So you want to engage a crisis communication firm to help you do this. You want to understand what are the various scenarios that could occur and who you're going to communicate with. And when you ask yourself, if my company were shut down for 5 days, who would I need to notify? What message would I want to put out there? Okay. And this includes shareholders, the SEC, regulators, customers, vendors, suppliers, and people that you are on the supply chain for as well. You also want to be able to work with your technology vendors and have them ready in advance as well.
Great. Well, we're getting some very interesting comments about how others are using their PR strategy and their view of it. The fourth poll question, which unfortunately we can't display, but we'd like to hear from you. What will improve your ransomware attack protection strategies? What have you thought of that would improve your firm's protection? If you could enter those thoughts into the chat, that would be great. So just to recap, we've seen the growth of ransomware attacks and the need for paying a lot more attention to it. We see how critical the software supply chain is and the vulnerabilities. We took a look at the legal strategies and PR strategies that you can use to help prevent the ransomware attacks. But then we also took a look at those same strategies you can use for resilience, post-attack impacts, and how you can minimize those impacts. What you need to do is take some next steps to start looking at the issues Mark raised. And he's graciously offered 1 hour of complimentary legal consulting for you and your general counsel to the first 15 attendees. So if you contact VIB and let them know you're interested, they will set that up for you. So what we do have now are some Q&A. We've got a lot of questions. So let's start off with Jerry. Jerry asked, what kind of staff do we need internally to make sure our ransomware legal strategy is appropriate and will ensure compliance of our software supply chain?
All right, so this is a combination of what you keep internally and what you keep externally. Internally, the most important thing is to have a knowledgeable CISO who understands these issues and a compliant general counsel. That is one who either understands the stuff or knows what questions to ask. All right, so that's what you need internally. Externally, you need to have a relationship with a forensics firm, an incident response firm, a threat intelligence firm, and outside counsel who understand this stuff. Those can all be the same people or similar people, but you need to have those relationships, and with a crisis communication firm.
Great. Alexandra asks, what are some ideas on how we set up a software supply chain compliance program? What kind of support will we need either internally or externally from consultants?
Well, okay, first, before you get to the consultants, internally, you're going to need a budget and resources, because to understand where your vulnerabilities are requires an assessment. So that's the first step. The second thing is you're going to need cooperation from the business units, because they're the ones who are dependent upon the supply chains to understand what their supply chains are. And the third thing you're going to need is you're going to need the ability to conduct audits, investigations, pen testing, and the like on you and on your vendors as well. You're also going to need to buy in from legal so they can compel these things from third parties as well.
Great. That's very helpful. John asks, what are some good example? What's a good example we can follow for PR strategies to help educate our supply chain vendors and our customers?
So to educate them is we're not. You're not going to be able to educate them on this stuff. At this point, we're past that point. Now you're at the point where you're going to have to compel them to do it. I don't care if they understand why and the like. You're going to have to compel them to do it.
Well, Roger has a question similar. He says, are there PR firms or security awareness firms who can help us to educate our employees or our vendors and customers?
Yeah, there are. I mean, any of the larger firms will have a crisis communications component to it. You want to seek out firms that specialize in crisis communications. Data breaches and ransomware attacks are not the same thing. Ransomware attacks and extortionware attacks are not the same thing. One of the problems you may have in an extortionware attack is that your response to it can draw attention to it. So if somebody steals emails that contain naked pictures of your CEO and threaten to release them, at that point, you're just going to draw attention to that, or other embarrassing stuff. You know what? It doesn't matter what the embarrassing thing is. So you need somebody who has experience in extortionware or experience in ransomware as part of their crisis communications portfolio.
Well, I guess this leads right into Carrie's question, which is, my firm has been through 2 attacks, and we really need an in-house negotiation capability. Who would be the best to train, and what training will they need?
You know, this is like saying I've had a number of my employees kidnapped in Colombia. I need an in-house hostage negotiation team. If you're getting hit that often by ransomware that you need an in-house team, you're probably going to be retaining people who are former FBI or Secret Service agents to do it. Most of that stuff you're going to do with outside consultants, because it's not something you need to do internally. You need somebody who does that for a living. You know, you need your Russell Crowe proof of life.
So you need, in other words, you need someone who does it all day long, and you're not going to have somebody in-house all day long doing it.
Yes,
basically.
that's correct.
Great. Well, we've run out of time. Mark, I want to thank you for your insights, and I want to invite your audience to submit your questions. If you have further ones, sorry we could not get to them, and we'll certainly email you back. But anyway, thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you in future cybersecurity webinars. Have a great evening.